Good morning, everyone. Here we go with the last part of Friday. Barry had a great afternoon. He played Stinky Pirate Revenge right up to the end. He only stopped playing to have lunch, which was also great. The 10 cheese pizza was fantastic. He also really liked the eggy Norman, which Malcolm ordered, and then let Barry eat Norman himself, who had an egg hat and a yoke tie. The secretary entity, however, did not have such a great afternoon. They stared in disbelief as Barry actually did pop his pizza crusts onto their empty plates. They stared in even more disbelief as both their parents sat on the sofa watching, while Barry and his flea control made Smellybeard walk the plank off his pirate ship, and when Smellybeard fell in the water, which turned out to be an enormous toilet sailing beside his ship, Malcolm and Marjorie clapped, and Marjorie said, "Oh, Barry, you're such a clever boy." But they saved their most disbelieving stares for when Malcolm and Marjorie came to them later in the afternoon with the plans for Barry's birthday party. "We love you, Barry, we do. We love you, Barry, we do. We love you, Barry, Barry, dear Barry." Malcolm and Marjorie held the note the longest. The secretary entity held it quite a lot shorter, but then it was hard to sing anything through gritted teeth. "We love you, Barry, we do." Malcolm and Marjorie clapped and cheered. Meanwhile, the secretary entity presented Barry with his cake. As directed by Barry on his plans, this involved both of them kneeling on one knee, on either side of the cake, and then handing it up to him. The cake was a chocolate one. On top of it, also in accordance with the plans, it said in strawberry icing, "To Barry, the best." Barry had thought about having them add "child in his house," but eventually decided that just "the best" was cooler. And, judging by the expressions on their faces as they handed over the cake, it was still having the same effect on the secretary entity, which was the point. "Oh, I'm so glad I decided to go for a party at home this time. It's been a very tiring week," said Barry, leaning over, ready to blow out the 10 candles. He took a deep breath and brought his lips close to the cake. The secretary entity glanced at each other, then suddenly they put their faces close to the cake too, and using their combined breath blew out every single one of the candles before Barry had a chance to. Barry looked up at Malcolm and Marjorie with a hurt expression on his face. "Girls, how dare you?" said Marjorie. "Yes," said Malcolm, "that's a terrible thing to do to Barry." "But that's what you told us to do," said Secretary 1. "Yes," said Secretary 2. "You said we had to do it because he's the one who normally gets punished, and so he wanted to see someone else get it in the neck for a..." "Shh!" said Malcolm with an anxious glance over at Barry. "You're spoiling it." "Yes," said Marjorie. "Could you stick to your lines, please?" The secretary entity looked very tired. "Okay, whatever," said Secretary 1. "Ha ha ha, we hate you, Barry. That's why we blew out your candles." She continued in a bored voice. "Yes, we just want to ruin your party because we're very, very selfish and annoying," said Secretary 2 in an equally bored voice. "Right," said Malcolm. "Exactly. So, go to your room." "Yes, to your room, with no cake," said Marjorie. "Hold on a minute," said Barry, raising his arm. "Yes, what is it, darling?" said Marjorie. Barry stood up. He looked at the secretary entity. "I think they should be allowed a slice of cake each before they go." "Well, that's very generous of you, Barry, isn't it, girls?" said Malcolm. "Seriously?" said Secretary 1. Marjorie just gave her a look. "Okay, yes, it's very generous," she said in a let's just get this over with way. "Yes, very generous," said Secretary 2 in exactly the same way. "Here you are," said Barry, who had sliced 2 sections of cake. He handed a plate to each of them. "Say thank you to Barry," said Marjorie. "Thank you, Barry," said the secretary entity in their bored voice. "Don't mention it," said Barry, handing over 2 forks. "Is it a vegan cake, Mummy?" said Secretary 1. "Yes. Sugar, nut, and indeed chocolate free?" said Secretary 2. Said Marjorie Bustle, looking at the cake awkwardly. "No." "Barry doesn't like those ones," said Malcolm, even more awkwardly. The secretary entity stared at the cake, like they would normally turn their noses up at it, but then again, they had only had some pizza crusts for lunch, so after a second they dived in and started eating. Suddenly, both of their faces contorted. "Ugh," said one. "Ugh," said the other. "What's the matter?" said Malcolm. It was hard for either of them to speak as their mouths were full of cake, but Secretary Entity 1 managed to say what looked like a mouthful of mud. Say through what looked like a mouthful of mud. It's got salt in it. Not in it, said Barry. On it. He held up a salt cellar and smiled. And, pepper. Barry held up the pepper grinder. Yes, sorry. Malcolm and Marjorie glanced at each other. Said Secretary 2, spitting crumbs of cake out onto the floor. Malcolm and Marjorie continued to look at each other. Then Marjorie leant over to Malcolm and whispered very quietly, I don't know how much more of this I can stand. I know, whispered Malcolm back, but what else can we do? Give up on the idea of a third child? Is that what you want? She looked for a second. Then she shook her head. Okay, said Malcolm, still whispering. So for the moment, just go with it, Marjorie. She nodded. They turned together. Ha ha ha, said Malcolm. What a funny joke, Barry. Yes, said Marjorie. That's one of the funniest practical jokes I've ever seen. You're so funny and clever. Barry was about to smile and say thank you when the secretary entity started making some very strange noises. Not just but also and then Secretary 1 fell to the floor, clutching her throat, followed almost immediately by Secretary 2 doing the same. Chapter 5. Are they okay? Said Marjorie. Yes, fine, aren't you girls? Said Malcolm. Said Secretary 1. Said Secretary 2. There you are, said Malcolm. Now for Barry. Up to this point, all of this had, in a way, been fun. Even though the secretary entity weren't exactly the sisterly entity, they were enough like them, in terms of looking and acting just the same, for Barry to really enjoy getting his own back for once. And it had felt nice, knowing that the grown-ups were always going to take his side, however badly he behaved. At the same time, it had also felt a little bit nasty. And, as the day had gone on, he had found that the thrill of being the favourite and being able to do things that he knew would get under the secretary entity's skin had got less and less, and the feeling of nastiness had grown. It was almost as if he had to get nastier and nastier to feel the same thrill again. Watching both sisters writhe on the floor, Secretary 1 had gone blue and Secretary 2 purple, should have felt great, because that's why he'd chosen this type of parent and drawn up a big plan for how they had to be, so that he could feel what it would be like to get revenge on his little sisters. But what was better than this? Barry had, after all, in his darkest moments, wished one or both of his sisters were dead. But it didn't feel great. It felt awful. And seeing Malcolm and Marjorie stand by while it was happening, because they didn't want to upset Barry, because they thought that's what he wanted them to do, felt even worse. So Barry stepped forward and said, "Time for the Grubenschnitzel maneuver." "Pardon?" said Malcolm. Even though you are our favourite, Barry," said Marjorie, "I don't think now is the best time for more food." "No," said Barry, "the Grubenschnitzel maneuver." Remembering exactly what Derek Fwam had done to him, he bent down quickly to Secretary 1. He grabbed her by the heels in order to pick her up and turn her upside down, but he only succeeded in dragging her legs halfway up his own body. Then he tried to do the same to Secretary 2, but her legs kept falling back down again. Eventually, he managed to get both of them on either side of him, with their legs sort of up against his sides. He raised his arms in order to slap them hard on the back in the correct Grubenschnitzel manner, but all he could manage from this position was a light tap on each of their bottoms, which was both useless and not a little embarrassing. By now, the secretary entity had started making noises that couldn't even be written down. Barry looked over to Malcolm and Marjorie to help, but they seemed rooted to the spot with terror. Barry turned back towards the door. He felt a huge swell of emotion building up in him. The thought of the secretary entity choking or being properly hurt in any way seemed suddenly like the worst thing possible. Barry realised there was something he needed to say. It was really just 2 words, but he hadn't said them for a very long time. He didn't even know if they were the right words in this strange, like his but not exactly like his world. There was nothing else left to do. "Ginny," he said. "Kay! Breathe! Please, breathe!" Even from their half upside down position, even while choking, even about to fall into unconsciousness, both little girls looked very surprised at this. So surprised, in fact, that both of them stuck their heads up and looked at Barry, and in doing so coughed violently, ejecting, like little spongy cannonballs from their throats, the pesky bits of salty peppery cake that had been lodged there. Both of these bits of cake, quite sloppy and messy by now, curved up in the air and hit Barry, splodge, simultaneously on each cheek. Immediately, Malcolm and Marjorie rushed to hug Kay and Ginny. As Barry watched the two girls being folded in their parents' arms, he realised something. Most parents didn't have favourites among their children. They loved all their children in different ways, at different times, and it didn't matter if sometimes that wasn't you, because soon it would be. And also that it was okay. No, it was nice, it was good to see your sisters loved. As it happened, after he'd had this deep and meaningful realisation about how it didn't matter about being a family favourite, he became this family's favourite. Marjorie looked round from hugging the girls and said, "Oh, Barry, thank you, Barry." "Yes, thank you, Barry," said Malcolm. "Actually, yes, thank you very much, Barry," said Secretary 1. "Me too with the thanks, Barry," said Secretary 2. And then they all came over and hugged him, which was lovely, although Barry did feel in the middle of it suddenly very tired. "But how did you know our names?" Secretary 1 was saying. "We never told you them." Barry just smiled wearily and said, "I'm going back to the parent agency." So there we go, that's the end of Friday. The last bit of the book, we find out what happens if you don't choose parents. See you tomorrow.